movement. We will discuss the national and state asbestos eradication agencies. Following that, we will discuss what asbestos eradication will look like or should look like. And lastly, we'll go through an asbestos action plan for HSRs, so stay tuned. Okay.
Okay, history, how did we get here? Up on the screen there should be a really good statement from Deb Valance at the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union, or sorry, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union now. And Dr. Valance is sort of one of the outstanding hard-working pioneers in union activity on asbestos. Look, the harsh reality is Australia has the highest asbestos-related deaths per capita of any country in the world, including the highest rate of mesothelioma. And of course, on top of that, there's an awful lot of lung cancers, which are almost certainly caused by exposure to asbestos, but aren't necessarily diagnosed that way. A recent report by Safe Work Australia has confirmed that the rate of asbestos-related deaths is increasing due to the long latency of asbestos-related diseases. But the majority of these deaths would have been preventable. Look, asbestos has been known to be dangerous for a century. As far as I'm aware, I think the Americans cottoned on to the dangers certainly by the 1930s. I have seen myself a letter from the Australian Navy to the dockyards at Williamstown in 1944 during the Second World War, saying that Navy personnel should not be exposed to asbestos. Yet we were continuing to mine it in the 50s and 60s over in Western Australia. And obviously we were using it in lots of housing and factory construction right up into the 1980s. So there's kind of a double standard here that people in government knew a very long time ago, but that asbestos was dangerous. It was the union movement that campaigned to shut down the asbestos mines. It was the union movement that campaigned to ban the importation of asbestos, and the union movement that campaigned to stop the use of asbestos in factories and industry, and in all workplaces, including offices. So a lot of unions can claim credit for what's been achieved so far. The maritime unions, the Seamen and the Waterside Workers Federation, the building and construction unions, the electricians and the plumbers and the carpenters, in the power industry, in the Latrobe Valley, and in public transport, the railways and the tramways unions all have achievements to their credit, but there's a hell of a lot of distance that we've still got to travel on this issue.
Okay, so what we're going to do is just go through a little timeline, as I mentioned. And again, I apologise for the camera at the moment. So if we look at the 1970s, so on the back of most of the union action that David was speaking about, together with growing public awareness of the dangers of asbestos exposure, came the rise of a lot of common law litigations and workers' compensation cases during the 70s and the 80s. Most notable amongst these were various civil lawsuits against CSR, which is the Colonial Sugar Refinery at the time, which mined the blue asbestos at the infamous Wittenoom Gorge, and James Hardie Industries, the largest asbestos manufacturing company in Australia. So with the first wave of asbestos-related diseases arising through the mining workforce, lawsuits against James Hardie began to reflect the second wave of asbestos-related diseases, so those in the manufacturing and construction industries who worked with asbestos products. For example, Bernie Benton, a few of you might remember this one, alongside the union movement, fought tirelessly in the campaign to make James Hardie Industries accountable in its failure to acknowledge the damage to workers' health and to compensate former employees affected by asbestos-related diseases. So indeed, the company tried to avoid paying compensation by moving offshore in 2001, and it was only through the actions of the unions, Bernie Banton, and Labor lawyers fighting in court that led to the establishment of a $4.5 billion fund for victims affected by asbestos-related diseases in 2004. However, even at that point, there were fears that probably wasn't going to be enough money. Now, in the 1980s, gradually, asbestos-containing material started to be phased out from production in Australia from early to late 1980s due to union pressure on building and manufacturing sites. Signposting these developments was the ban of all raw blue asbestos mining in Australia in 1983 and raw brown asbestos exports in 1984. In 1985, asbestos use in the housing and construction industry was banned in effect, and tighter regulations and controls throughout the 1980s continued across national and state jurisdictions, but fell short of the complete ban. These restrictions basically started in the UK with an industry-agreed code in construction called the VAEA code, which actually formed the basis of Victoria's first asbestos regulations. So interesting fact there. Now, in the 1990s, unions and interest groups continued lobbying government and industry throughout the 90s. And in 1989, Victoria Trades Hall Council passed a resolution to ban the manufacture of asbestos and asbestos products by 1995. In 1992, the AMW endorsed a total ban on asbestos at their national conference. In the same year, the Victorian government commissioned a report conducted by the Victorian Occupational Health and Safety Commission that recommended a ban on the use of asbestos. And in response to this inquiry, industry in Victoria announced a voluntary phase out of asbestos products by 1996. However, this did not eventuate by the mid-1990s. And the anti-asbestos movement basically had to start shifting its attention to the federal government. All right.
Okay, so we're moving up the timeline to what happened in the early 2000s. The federal government has a body, NICNAS, the National Industrial Chemicals Notification and Assessment Process. Ironically, the current federal government is looking at trying to privatise NICNAS or have industry do self-regulation without any external examination or external scrutiny, which is unbelievable, but that's another struggle that I think we'll get drawn into. But NICNAS in 1999 undertook a priority report on the use and occupational exposure of asbestos. Coming out of that NICNAS report, with recommendations for the phase out of asbestos, the then National Occupational Health and Safety Commission, which is now called Safe Work Australia, failed to act. And I guess in response to that failure, the union movement decided that direct action was required. The ACTU called on all affiliated unions to take action in support of a ban on the importation of asbestos, and as in addition to a ban on the manufacturing of asbestos products. So the maritime unions, very much to their credit, put an immediate ban on the importation of Canadian asbestos. Unfortunately, the Canadians continue to mine asbestos even after most other countries that have the mineral deposits have banned asbestos mines. The Maritime Union's initiative led to the Victorian Labor government in 2000 putting a ban on importation, and that was followed by Queensland, New South Wales and Tasmania. So effectively the action of states forced the hand of the Howard government, and the Howard government in 2003 banned the importation of asbestos. We then get into, unfortunately, the problem of enforcement or compliance with that ban. And because of the lack of resourcing of the the importation department, we know that only a certain number, a limited small number of containers are checked for asbestos, and consequently asbestos containing materials are still coming in to Australia. Once they're here, then the responsibility, I think, devolves to the states, and I guess what we're asking is that the states have to be a lot more proactive on tracking down illegal asbestos imports. So the federal government announced the ban on importation, use and recycling of white asbestos. This action wouldn't have occurred had it not been for the militancy and the commitment of the union movement. And that's something that we can take some pride in. But as I say, I guess it's more maybe observed in the breach, and there's a lot of asbestos still floating around the community. Despite the ban, the legacy of asbestos that remains in situ in our built environment has created a third wave of asbestos-related diseases. So what has been done to address asbestos in our built environment, and is it enough? I think the answer is going to be no, unfortunately.
Now, before we get into that, I might just throw back a question. Now, does anyone in the audience actually remember the history of the union movement's fight to ban asbestos, or was anybody actually involved in that movement? I mean, do you have any stories to tell from that experience, David? Were you?
Well, I mean, it's an issue that is strong enough to get people out on the streets, and there were demonstrations against asbestos. Also, I think very effectively, we persuaded the political wing of the movement to take action. So I'd give credit to, say, the Carr government in New South Wales, really led the way in banning asbestos. The problem is, Roxanne, particularly I think in relation to demolition, we all know that asbestos, if it's in a stable environment, should be monitored, but that it's not an immediate threat to health and safety. We've got demolition both in commercial or industrial environments, but also in home environments that is bringing asbestos and making asbestos loose. Let's say we're in Carlton this evening. Within 10 kilometres of where we are, there'd probably be 20 demolition jobs starting up around now, or probably within the last hour. They work at night, it's noisy, it's messy, it's dirty work. Of those 20 jobs, probably 10 of them involve exposure to asbestos. Of the 10 that involve exposure to asbestos, maybe 5 have licensed removalists on hand. The other 5 will be exposing workers to asbestos as they're breaking up walls, partitions, removing doors, window frames. Anywhere where there's asbestos has been used as insulation, as a fire retardant, and asbestos was the sort of wonder material in the 1950s and 1960s. Yeah. And I guess the exposure that I personally have had to asbestos has been in kind of demo or work of realigning sort of walls inside a workplace, inside a factory, and you drill into a wall, you're releasing asbestos. You pull something down, you pull up some flooring, or you remove some roofing, you're releasing asbestos fibres. So it's happening. My concern is it will be happening around Melbourne as we speak.
And we will get to that in a moment because there are a couple of incidents. But for those who have just joined, we were just asking if anyone was present during the 70s and early 90s when the hard forces of asbestos ban were happening through the trade union movement. And we've had Rose chime in and say that Victor, who was the camera operator who shot the first footage that was used in evidence in the Supreme Court of Victoria, the asbestos case in 1986. Now, I'm not too sure what that case was.
Fantastic.
That is fantastic.
Look, I suspect, this is my speculation, but I suspect that would be probably maybe a workers' compensation case establishing the linkage, the causal linkage of asbestos exposure to the illness that someone maybe was making a claim for. And it certainly would have gone through the system up to the Supreme Court, because making a legal ruling on that connection was vital for every asbestos claim that came afterwards. So all credit to Victor.
And I do remember something about Victoria having the first litigation case in 1986, which set the precedent. So possibly that was the same case, Victor, I'm not too sure. And Rose is also, Jade has also mentioned that she had a recent staff member who was a plumber and recently passed away from asbestos-related cancer. So it is ever present, as we've been saying. Okay, so now we'll just quickly move on, just for time purposes. All right, now let's discuss ASEA. So ASEA is the peak national body, so the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency. Now in June, in June 2010, a coalition of unions, the Cancer Council and asbestos support groups, held a national summit on asbestos, and this was with the aim to make Australia asbestos free. And therefore to eventually eliminate asbestos-related diseases and exposure to all forms of asbestos in Australia. In support of achieving these outcomes, the summit called for the establishment of an independent National Asbestos Authority to coordinate and oversee these objectives across all levels of government and the wider community. The success of the summit was confirmed later that year, with the then Minister for Workplace Relations, announcing the establishment of a National Asbestos Management Review in October 2010, and this was commissioned by the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, which was Julia Gillard. In addition to asbestos management and research, the review was tasked to make recommendations for the establishment of a national strategic plan to improve asbestos management, education and reporting in Australia. As part of the consultation process, an issue paper for public comment was available, and the VTHC, Victorian Trades Hall Council, was amongst those who sent in a submission. The report, entitled the Asbestos Management Review Report, was released by the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, Bill Shorten, at the second Asbestos Summit in 2012. And that was organised again by unions, the Cancer Council and asbestos disease support groups. Its recommendations included the development of a national strategic plan to improve asbestos awareness, identification and management in the wider community, and the establishment of an independent national agency to guide the implementation. So initially, the Office of Asbestos Safety was established in September 2012 to begin developing the National Strategic Plan. And then this office was superseded by the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency on July the 1st, 2013, as a statutory body under the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency Act of 2013. Now, this was introduced by this act was introduced by Bill Shorten, and the passing of this act was absolutely historic. Never before in the world had there been a nationally coordinated response to the management and removal of asbestos, let alone in Australia's history. Unions had long been campaigning for the safe removal of asbestos, and the introduction of this act into Parliament was testament to the hard work of the union movement.
Very good.
I might get you to pop your head in a little bit.
Good idea.
Yeah, there
sure.
we go.
So what does the ASEA do? Look, it was created fundamentally at our behest, and so all credit to Julia Gillard and Bill Shorten. Peter Tighe from the electrical trades shifted over to become its CEO. Jeff Ari, who'd been with the ACTU, was the inaugural chair of its board. So it had some good hearts in the right places. The current government has done its darndest to strangle it financially. I think they really would like to get rid of it altogether, but they don't want the embarrassment of actually abolishing it, so they just neuter it. But look, the agency is good. It does provide a national focus on asbestos safety in the workplace. It's supposed to be an independent statutory body that coordinates, monitors and reports on the implementation of a national strategic plan. It coordinates the states and territories, that's all good, and local government. The agency was tasked with creating and maintaining a public exposure register. The establishment of Australia's first national exposure register was proposed in the bill following a crisis meeting to address the concerns of Telstra workers who were being exposed to asbestos during the construction of the NBN. Now, the register captures personal details of people, their exposure to asbestos, the nature of the suspected exposure, witness details, and then, unfortunately, perhaps later on, whether the person comes down with a asbestos-related disease. But the work of the national authority is limited because it has no power over what the states and territories actually do. Further, its funding has been threatened by the current government, and the board has been changed in favour of employers fundamentally. So it's good that it exists, but I mentioned before the problem with customs. I would have thought that a serious national government agency would be down at the docks, would be going through the paperwork, particularly importations from certain Asian countries, which don't have similar policies against asbestos that freely and widely use asbestos in their products. But you know, it's missing in action. So really, we're the only people who are going to put asbestos on the political agenda, and we're the only people who are going to give this national authority some teeth.
So yeah, I mean, speaking of teeth, actually, this kind of brings us to the political situation we're having with the state body as well. So Victoria's response to ASEA's National Strategic Plan was the establishment of the Victorian Asbestos Eradication Agency in March of 2016. And this was a couple of years after ASEA was established. And note that under a previous Conservative government, there had been no uptake. So the Victorian Asbestos and Eradication Agency focuses on the targeted and prioritised removal of asbestos in government buildings across Victoria, including schools and hospitals, so only government buildings. In this aspect, its aims are much smaller and more limited than ASEA's. And unlike ASEA's plan, the Victorian agency does not deal with domestic residences, whether public or privately owned. It does, however, seek to establish an aggregated register of asbestos in Victorian government buildings, detailing the identification of the presence and condition of asbestos. Established under the State-Owned Enterprise Act of 1992, the Victorian Agency is a subsidiary of WorkSafe and reports directly to the Minister of Finance. When first announced, the Victorian Agency was expected to be established by the end of 2016. It also states under the Act that within 24 months of establishment, the agency is expected to submit a report on the asbestos register listing, as well as an analysis on the present and future risks posed to workers experiencing injury from the presence of asbestos as identified in the aforementioned register. Yet, we are nearing the end of 2017 and little headway has been made. As it stands, there is no clear strategy or timeline in place that has been released by the agency on the prioritised removal of asbestos across the state. Indeed, the agency doesn't even have its own website, and very little information has been made publicly available other than a few media releases announcing its expected establishment date, which of course has now lapsed. So most alarmingly, however, is that there was no community consultation with stakeholders and support groups prior to the agency's establishment. Following the appointment of the agency's board members in December 2016, the Finance Minister, Robert Scott, quoted, "The Victorian Asbestos Eradication Agency will be overseen by experts with extensive experience in asbestos safety and risk minimisation. These appointments will allow the agency to begin its vital work as soon as possible." Now, Scott's emphasis on asbestos risk minimisation as opposed to asbestos eradication leaves a lot to be desired. Indeed, after contacting the director of the agency, I received material outlining a 2-year plan for the prioritised removal, which included research and the development of a risk assessment model and the assessment of risks of identified asbestos-containing materials. So this just basically confirms that we need to push these agencies to deal with the issue at the source, and that is eradicating asbestos and not simply managing it.
Yeah. Look, Roxanne, I'll comment quickly on this. There are some good people there, again, good hearts. The idea of a centralised agency is something that we promoted. It's certainly true that we would have liked to have had a chance to have some input into the structure of it, but I think the political reality was that asbestos had been uncovered, I think, in some schools, and there was a lot of anxiety and concern out in the community, and the government felt that it needed to be seen to be doing something quickly. I think the lack of action since the creation of the agency is cause for concern for all of us. But the idea of centralised agency in itself is a good thing, because the big problem we face in Victoria, in my opinion, is that this issue falls between different organisations. You've got the EPA with some responsibility, but then they maybe hand pass to WorkSafe, which has some responsibility. Then WorkSafe maybe does a hand pass to the Health Department, who has some responsibility, and then ultimately they hand pass to local government. If you have asbestos in your home or in your local community, the first port of call is supposed to be your local council. If you have asbestos in your workplace, which almost certainly you will, your first port of call is supposed to be WorkSafe. The EPA maybe has a broader responsibility for the environment overall, but the EPA comes within the Department of Environment. So you've got maybe too many different agencies, and the idea, I think, behind the Eradication Agency was to draw everything together. But the problem is it just seems to be another one in addition to all of the others, that it actually hasn't centralised power. It's based, I think, at the moment inside WorkSafe. I think we would have probably preferred it to have been based in Premier's Department, that it needed some extra grunt or power to pull all of the other departments into line. So it's a work in progress, but as you correctly point out, the clock is ticking. They want to have some runs on the board by next year. There's really an urgent need in the Education Department. There's an urgent need in the Health Department, making sure that asbestos is eradicated from public hospitals. Not so much a danger for patients in public hospitals, but certainly a danger for workers in public hospitals. So, the public sector, I can understand they have to start somewhere, and okay, their decision is to start with the public sector, with public buildings. let alone, you know, the whole home renovation thing is a nightmare scenario, but that at the moment has been hand-passed to local councils. So we've got a lot on our plate here in Victoria.
And even we've had a comment by Paul who mentions there was the promise to remove all asbestos in Victorian schools,
Yeah.
that the Australian Education Union were on, and this is part of what the Victorian Agency should be doing.
Yes.
And we haven't seen much in progress with that. But okay, but let us move on. So we're talking about this traction. We're talking about this idea of centralized system in place, but something's not going well here.
Yeah, look, this is an interesting story. Late last month, 25 workers renovating the Opera House up in Sydney were exposed to asbestos. Despite the asbestos being identified and tested, it took up to 7 days before WorkSafe and the union were notified. The electrical trades then intervened and a cease work, thank God, was put in place. But the incident points to failed compliance. The initial risk assessment failed to put in adequate safety controls in place. So it's a systemic failure and a wider problem with the system of asbestos management in Australia. It kind of, it's a good, bad case study, if you like. It sort of sums up at an iconic location the problems. We acknowledge that asbestos is a problem, but we don't seem to be coping with responding to that problem. We've had examples here in Victoria with the discovery of asbestos during the refurbishment at the Iron Ear Hospital. A few weeks ago, new housing developments at the old paper mill site in Alphington discovered buried asbestos. And just over a week ago, it was discovered that asbestos had spilled out over the Chandler Highway widening, where construction workers found buried asbestos in the soil. You know, asbestos is being dumped around Victoria. According to Peter Tighe at the National Agency, his quote is, "There is clearly a breakdown of the system. We really need to move from management of asbestos to a proactive program of removing high-risk asbestos from Australian buildings," end quote. And it begs the question, what about the system? What about our system is failing?
Okay, so before we touch on that question, does anyone remember the incident at the Opera House coming to the media, or has anyone heard about the asbestos that was recently found by the Chandler Highway construction? I know that the CFMEU were on top of that when the asbestos was found recently, but I'd love to hear some comments from you guys. And also, you know, if we're having the CEO of the National Agency point out that there is something wrong with the system, I'd love to actually hear what you guys currently think about our asbestos management system. Do you think it works, or do you think it's actually failing? And do you think that there is another system in place that we should be following? Now, Rose has said that she has heard of the 2 incidents happening in the media. But yeah, I would love to actually hear what you guys think about the asbestos management system before we actually discuss the question, what about the system is failing? All right, so far we have 60% of people saying that they believe that the system's failing, 80%. All right, so no one's going for option 2, which is a nice thing to hear. There is no system, Rose says. That is a good point, and we will get to I guess we'll use quotations when we say the system. All right, I'm going to share the results. Option 1, 100%.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for participating in that quickly. Okay, so let's get to this question. So, what about the system is failing? Now, the incident at the Opera House clearly, and the other ones in Victoria, clearly encapsulate why our asbestos laws, or in quotation marks laws, are failing. Each state has strict regulations on asbestos, yet they did not manage to prevent the exposure to asbestos that occurred during the Opera House renovations. So for example, the regulations to protect workers in buildings from asbestos exposure require an asbestos register, a management plan, an appraisal of the area where asbestos is identified prior to demolition or refurbishment, and the removal of high-risk asbestos before workers enter the workplace. Now, these regulations clearly were not followed by management prior to the commencement of the renovations at the Opera House, because if they did, they wouldn't have been struck by asbestos as they were renovating. So while regulations do exist, we know that enforcement is lacking. And as an example, in Victoria alone, between 2012 and 2016, WorkSafe only prosecuted 21 offences in relation to asbestos breaches of the regulations. Now, this does not include the number of provisional improvement notices that may have been issued by health and safety reps prior to these prosecutions. So when we talk about the system failing, the lack of prosecutions for failed compliance with asbestos legislation is just one element of a wider problem. And this is why what we as unions want is the eradication of all forms of asbestos, because one cannot be exposed to asbestos or contract asbestos-related diseases if there is no asbestos in our built environment to be exposed to. So it's pretty common knowledge. Now, this brings us to the issue of management versus eradication. So although the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency has in its title the eradication of asbestos, the system approach it advocates for is asbestos management, not removal. And as some of you have pointed out, it isn't actually a system at all. Now, one of the justifications for this management approach was that mainly employers believed it was better not to disturb non-friable asbestos in the built environment if it does not pose an immediate risk. However, asbestos contaminated material in the built environment is deteriorating, and this increases the risk of exposure. So it must be remembered that even the most recent materials containing asbestos are approaching 30 years old. And as the peak usage of asbestos containing material was prior to the 1970s, most of these are now 40 to 50 years old and have been exposed to weathering and contact with machinery, vibrations and human activity. So all of these do affect its structure. And like we have seen with the incident at the Opera House, our asbestos regulations aren't always strictly complied with. So while the federal government adopts a risk assessment and management approach, and the state body in Victoria, the union's position is the prioritised removal approach, eliminating all asbestos from our built environment by 2030. And part of this vision would be to see ASEA and the Victorian body enforcing a staged asbestos removal approach with the ability to fine for non-compliance, or at least with the government being able to allow that. So, however, the current system of asbestos management or risk management approach is ineffectual, and there is no safe level of exposure to asbestos. So preferencing a risk management approach ensures the existence of asbestos and will never achieve the elimination of the risks of exposure to asbestos, nor the elimination of the burden of asbestos-related diseases. And this risk management approach, together with the unwillingness and inability to prosecute or fail compliance, we find the recipe for a failing system. Now, let's not forget that the vast majority of these diseases are preventable if asbestos was eradicated. And unless this is achieved, Australians will continue to be exposed and thousands more will contract mesothelioma and other asbestos-related diseases.
Yeah, look, I agree. It really is a reality that both in workplaces, offices, as well as factories, you have asbestos that may be currently, linings of walls, linings of doors, lagging or cladding that is relatively stable, but and likewise in domestic, in homes. But when you have renovations, when you have changes to the workplace, when you have, the maintenance department is asked to move a wall or move some machines from one side of the factory to the other side of the factory, they're pulling up lagging, they're releasing friable or powdered dry asbestos into the atmosphere. The starting point, I think, is the register that you have to force the manager or the employer to be honest about the presence of asbestos in the workplace, and that people need to know where the asbestos is. Look, most walls or doors made in the 50s and 60s may well have asbestos lining as a fire retardant. You drill a hole, you put a window in, and you're running the risk of releasing asbestos into the atmosphere. I think this is a classic example for health and safety reps. You can have the best policies in the world, but if they're sitting on the shelf and not being implemented, if there's no effective compliance, then the policies are worthless. And my fear is that we have governments, local, state and federal, that are intimidated by the scale of the problem.
What needs to be done?
Because we had a love affair with asbestos in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. That it was put into everything. It was put into bloody bitumen, roof ceilings, floor ceilings, vinyl tiles. Anywhere where it was felt to be relevant to have some fire retardant, you put asbestos into the mix, and we're now reaping the results of
the
that.
legacy. Now, but before David continues on with this, Rose has actually mentioned something interesting here. She said that as part of the management review that was given out by ASEA, they said if houses were built prior to 1987, they should all be audited and inspected for asbestos. And Rose is saying that she believes all buildings prior to selling should have an inspection to determine even where the asbestos is. And she's also said that all the roofs made of the corrugated asbestos sheeting, it's degrading, and although it is a non-fireable product, it is weathering and fibers are flying all around the city. And you're exactly right. And I'm glad you've mentioned this, because it really brings us to the point of our next slide, which is how do we get to asbestos eradication? From the place we're in management, how do we get to eradication?
Good on you. Good on you, Roxanne and Rose. Okay, how do we get there? Trades Hall participated in both of the National Asbestos Summits, which were the catalyst for the establishment of the National Agency. And we endorsed, or the Victorian Union movement endorsed, the National Declaration towards an Australian safe asbestos-free environment, which calls for the elimination of any exposure to asbestos. While the summits were in 2010 and 2012, their recommendations are still relevant today, because asbestos is still with us, unfortunately. So I think we've proposed, a pyramid approach to modifying the system towards eradication rather than management. So the first point is, the elimination of asbestos via a hierarchy of control. Following the hierarchy, the most effective way to work towards the elimination of asbestos-related diseases is to eliminate the exposure to asbestos itself, and to do this by removing the dangerous material. In contrast, while the National Strategic Plan calls for the removal, this is only restricted to priority areas and doesn't call for the total elimination of all states of asbestos. So effectively, it's a risk management approach rather than an eradication approach. So the first thing is the Phaseout Program. The elimination of asbestos is to be achieved by implementing a 20-year phase-out program involving the prioritised removal of asbestos from the built environment. So you'd have to have an assessment process, red being immediate removal, yellow within 5 years, and green within 15 years. No such phase-out program exists in the national plan, and that's a problem. So that, is the starting point for us. We need to get a national commitment to a phase-out program. Second, education and raising public awareness. We've been, pretty effective in this regard, but we have to sort of persist. The Trades Hall has called for a highly publicised and targeted awareness campaign, particularly in the construction industry across all states of Australia. This was successfully rolled out in Victoria a few years ago, and we think that the lessons from Victoria can be shared nationally. That's an appropriate role for the national agency. Then identification, removal, handling and storage and disposal practices. Trades Hall believes that the federal government should enforce prioritised removal, that owners of private property should be legally required to identify asbestos in their property, that we should promote the use of licensed removalists for all removal work. We should promote transparent pricing for removal and disposal, provide disincentives through council rates for homes with asbestos-containing materials, and ensure regulators improve compliance activities for the disposal of asbestos, including fines for illegal asbestos dumping. None of these measures currently exist in the National Strategic Plan. Then reporting and disclosure of where asbestos is located. There should be a national audit of asbestos that includes asbestos in public buildings, workplaces, domestic premises, and disposal and dump sites. As the construction unions are finding, there is a lot of asbestos buried around the place. The decontamination of former industrial sites is a giant problem for the construction industry and for a growing Melbourne. We say Melbourne is going to be 5 million people. A lot of those people are going to be potentially exposed to contaminated land. Reporting and disclosure of where asbestos is located. The national authority should maintain and coordinate a central audit of all naturally occurring asbestos. And to date, the national agency's exposure register does not include any of the protocols that we'd like to see. It's optional to register, and it only applies to individuals who may have been exposed at home or during employment. On the other hand, the Victorian Agency's exposure register will only apply to government-owned buildings. So it's only really handling half of the problem. Then research management and reporting. The National Agency have included in their national plan research to inform policy and practice, as well as commission research to prevent or minimise risk from exposure. In addition to that useful research, Trades Hall believes the federal government must develop nationally uniform legislation covering all aspects of asbestos in workplaces, domestic, as well as disposal. A nationally consistent approach to the management of dust disease, compensation claims, and lastly, a national approach for medical research by seeking government funding and allocating such funding.
Now, Rosie has mentioned that in the ACT, there is mandatory training for all construction workers relating to asbestos awareness, which is definitely something that should be adopted across every state. Now, having said that, I'd like to get an idea of what you guys think about the proposal or Trade Hall's proposal or their approach towards asbestos eradication. So I'm just going to fly through a quick little poll here. But yeah, I mean, the parts of it that you disagree with, do you agree with all of it? Do you disagree with all of it? What parts seem intuitive to you? What parts seem like they would work? I'd love to hear your feedback. Now, I do note the time here, and we are 3 minutes to 8. Ooh. So,
my apologies for rabbiting on too much.
Okay. We'll finish off with this. I was going to go through an action plan for health and safety reps on asbestos.
Ooh, that's the most important part.
It is important, but luckily I'll be creating a document for you guys to use and download, so I'll make that available next week. And we can just finish this off with the results of the poll, which is an overwhelming 100% support for VTAC's position there. So yeah,
well, that's encouraging.
It's really good news.
Yeah.
But I mean, are there any questions, any ideas, any stories you guys want to share about this? Any proposals you've seen, like Rose has mentioned, from the ACT's mandatory training? Is there anything you guys have seen in other states that you think is interesting?
Look, I think protecting construction workers is, because they really are the front line in potential exposure. As I say, demolition in particular is kind of the poor cousin of construction. Construction is nice and positive, putting new places up. And I mean, we've got some issues obviously with aluminium cladding and some of the things that are used in construction, but by and large, the construction side is pretty good in preventing the use of asbestos, but it's bloody demolition. It's the demolishing old factories, demolishing old offices, demolishing houses,
home
renovations. This is where, unfortunately, workers are being exposed.
And it's become, you know, we were talking previously about, you know, the first wave of asbestos diseases coming from mining, the second wave coming from the manufacturing of products. We've got a third wave coming in, and that's from home renovations.
Yeah.
And, you know, the responsibility of the government to do something about this, to have people properly trained so that they're not getting influenced by, you know, shows like The Block, that they can just do easy renovations at home and no consideration for any risk assessment there. It's daunting.
Look, schools, how often would you hear of a working bee at a school, the mums and dads come in on a weekend to maybe pull down an old shelter shed, put up a new shelter shed. What are they pulling down? So I think, look, I'm not criticising the state for starting with public buildings, and certainly the school system is crying out for urgent action, our schools, public and private schools. But at the same time, domestic housing is just a ticking time bomb. And, you know, a lot of the people working in the small jobs in domestic housing aren't unionised. And so we've got to be pretty hard and tough and be pretty interventionist in getting out and about the suburbs and poking our noses in, and maybe there'll be some pushback. There'll be people who aren't happy being called up. But the dumping of asbestos material, we know that it's being dumped around the suburbs. We know that it's being dumped in country towns, and it's deliberately, consciously illegal. There are people who know that they're breaking the law, and they're doing it for the dollar. They don't give a damn. We've got to. We really need proactive agencies. We need inspectors, and we need HSRs with the right sorts of powers to stop work and to call the managers and employers to account and get access to the real information about where asbestos is in their workplace.
Yeah, and again, I do apologise for running out of time to go through the asbestos action plan for health and safety reps, but this stuff is very important. And if you do have any questions about this action plan or what to do, if you've encountered asbestos, or a work colleague has encountered asbestos or has previously been exposed, please send us in any questions you have about this. But I will refer you to the document that we create. And as always head to the OHS rep website, because there's plenty of guidance in there for you guys.
Ask Renata. Send an email in. Ask Renata. Yeah. Thanks for your participation, and hopefully we can have another session to follow up.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.